So we're really happy that Mark Sussman is here to clarify everything about Royal de Luxe and their work in Montreal. And maybe I'll step aside and watch and learn, and then afterwards we can have questions. I'll come back for the question session. So, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mark Sussman.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you guys for being here. It's a real great pleasure. The last time I was at University of Connecticut was for the awesome conference that John and Claudia Orenstein and Dacia Posner organized in 2012. So that predates the Ballard Institute being in this beautiful space and with this astounding exhibit in front. So I'm very pleased to see today the new incarnation. I know it's been here a while, but it's my first visit since the old days, so it's very exciting. Yes, thank you, Emily and John, for organizing tonight. As John said, I teach at a university in Montreal, and Montreal was the first North American host for this company from France, Royal de Luxe, who some of you have probably seen videos online, or has anyone seen them live? Ah, amazing.
No, not live.
Oh, not live. I'm just curious if anyone's seen them. You've seen them in person. But not many people have, unless they really come to where you are. And I'll talk a bit about the logistics. So the talk is loosely organized around these ideas of poetics and logistics as sort of fighting each other when something of this scale comes to a city. And I'm very interested in your questions. In fact, I'm mostly interested in what you are curious about. I really only know the company from the Montreal performances and then some interviews I've done and a bit of reading and research and whatnot. I have at the end some video, so I'll show some still images, and feel free to make the light on me darker if it helps to see the images, whoever's on the lights. Finally, I just want to also say, in thinking about coming to University of Connecticut, where there is such a prestigious puppetry program and students and faculty working very intensively with puppetry, and also perhaps people not in the puppetry world who are interested or care about it or are regulars here at the Ballard Institute. I realize there's an array of different sort of levels of hands-on knowledge around puppetry. So in the writing, in the talk, I try to sort of do a little bit of description, a little bit of analysis, but it's not, here's describing the thing and here's what I think it means. I don't really organize it that way. It's a bit woven together, so bear with it. I'll just sort of a disclaimer and warning up front. Okay. And I'll start with a quote from the artist Claes Oldenburg from a text of his called Proposals for Monuments and Buildings, 1965 to 1969. Oldenburg says, "If I think of my eyes as the view from an airplane and the floor of my studio as a landscape, then the ordinary objects lying around seem colossal. If I then identify the landscape of the floor as, for example, Manhattan Island, the colossal objects acquire a specific comparative size, a pencil sharpener the size of a 5-story tenement, a bed half the size of Central Park. In drawing, I sometimes feel like a worker on a huge form, a painter on an ocean liner." That's just meant to sit there from Claes Oldenburg. "We call them giants, not marionettes, not puppets. This is the first thing we're told, arriving at a mid-sized warehouse complex in Lachine, Quebec, by the highway that runs from downtown to the airport and points west. Since the arrival of the first shipping containers on April 6, 2017, And after 3 years of meetings, route negotiations, and logistical and engineering planning, the Royal Deluxe Company has installed itself here. Temporary traveling workshops spill out of trailers and cargo containers. There's a field office, medical trailer, costume and machine shops, indoor and outdoor practice areas where seasoned company members repeat the basic maneuvers of these large figures: walking, reaching, dancing, stopping, turning the gaze this way and that. And the climax of our short visit, a run-through of what will be the final exit of the Scaphandrier, the deep sea diver, hoisted by a crane into the air and gently lowered into a double-wide blue cargo container with an open top and a human-sized door at the base that's then tilted 90 degrees on its back onto a waiting flatbed trailer in the parking lot of the Maison Radio-Canada Tower, a large open space within sight of the St. Lawrence River, the Molson Brewery with its red neon sign, and the newly illuminated Jacques Cartier Bridge. These are all iconic structures and within the site of the neighborhood of Hochelaga, the city borough that bears the name of the Iroquois settlement long predating the arrival of Europeans. Can you see it okay?
Yeah.
I mentioned this confluence of industrial patrimony, effluvial topology, and the city's prodigious reputation as a place of license and festive exceptionality, at least compared with the rest of Catholic Quebec, because the Royal Deluxe Giants, with their relatively simple dramaturgy of arriving, waking, traveling, sleeping, resting, and reuniting, by their very presence seem to animate overlapping sets of the city's myths, stories, and contemporary pressure points. So I'm going to just try to illuminate a few of those different connections. Montreal is the nation's city, Canada that is the nation's city in a nearly perpetual state of festivity, official and unofficial. From the internationally known Jazz Festival and the Just for Laughs Comedy Festival, to the annual invasion of the Formula One Grand Prix race car aficionados, to anarchist, literary, dance, and animation, documentary, and puppetry festivals, Montreal prides itself on its ability to celebrate. And of course, Montreal is arguably the North American capital of the new circus, anchored by Cirque du Soleil and the National Circus School. We are a small group on a discreet visit in the week before the Giants' 3-day appearance in Montreal, starting on May 19th. And I'm looking for clues as to how the story of these 3 silent characters, the diver, the little giant, and her dog, Cholo, who's there, will map their own story onto the cities at a precarious moment. It's the raising of the curtain on a year's worth of costly programming, infrastructure beautification, and other community programs as well, perhaps as a critical reflection on the city's layers of history. The full Royal Deluxe Company transplants itself from their home base in the city of Nantes, France, while on the road. Given the logistical complexity of their urban appearances, the setup and training required, and the timing of transportation by sea, the company can visit a maximum of 2 or possibly 3 cities per year. 95 members of the company travel from France, and 30 local acrobats, that's a term used by the Montreal 375 event producer Martin Bolduc, were trained as Lilliputians. This is the term used by the company for the crew of manipulators, riggers, machinists, and yes, puppeteers that attend each giant, moving their limbs, controlling their eyelids, and giving them life in finely detailed choreographed moves and larger scale maneuvers. They appear as a serious, coordinated, and rather elegant crowd, they're French after all, with specific tasks relating to the movement of a knee or elbow, the fastening of the diver's helmet, or the tying of the little giant's rain hat. And here in the dusty parking lot by the highway, they're practicing these maneuvers learning to move at pace in a group, to stop, take a position, and respond to the captain of each team calling commands through a megaphone, broadcasting to a sound system built into each giant's traveling rig. A week's paid rehearsal is all there is to give each giant life. Local crane operators must also be on hand to practice moves that require the heavier equipment, as, for example, when the diver is hoisted above the Chinatown arch on Rue Saint-Laurent and set down on the other side. In addition to the synchronized mechanics of the movement, the performing crew are training in a rigorous puppetry job. That is, the attitude of treating the material object, on whatever scale it is, as something possessing its own material and fictional life, while at the same time pulling the ropes, activating each limb bend or neck roll just the right amount to achieve a convincing effect of life. The performance job of the Lilliputians, then, is to perform their tasks of attending to the giants with a minimum of their own performance ego and a maximum of deference to these figures as they move on prescribed routes through the city, routes, landmarks, and sleeping and resting points negotiated over 2 years prior. Even though there were last-minute changes, and that's another story. The giants have a backstory, loosely mapped onto multiple stories, past and present, of the place they're visiting, typically on some civic occasion and in ritually significant or otherwise monumental spaces. The Montreal performance in May 2017 was simply titled Les Géants, the Giants, and opened the Montreal 375 celebration. The client was effectively the public-private society that produced Montreal 375, and they later estimated that 622,000 spectators saw the Giants. In previous cities, Santiago, Berlin, Guadalajara, Liverpool, London, the numbers climb into the several million per performance, making the company perhaps the highest attended street theater company in the world, though of course there's no way to know. After weeks of anticipating their arrival and days of running around the city, it became increasingly difficult to catch glimpses as the crowds grew exponentially in size by the hour. The first sort of awakening of the Giants was on a Friday morning, so that was a work day and the crowds were relatively light, and then Friday afternoon as people got off work, they got sort of built through Saturday and Sunday, at which point it became overwhelming to even try and get close to see them. Competing questions and overlapping historical frames emerged. How does the seemingly simple appearance of slow-moving giants energize and animate the existing public space of a city, rendering it more than just a municipal branding exercise by allowing for unexpected, unplanned, affective moments of emotional connection, moments of laughter and surprise? Company founder and director Jean-Luc Courcou sets the tone for everyone involved with the project, imposing a certain dramaturgical rigor. They're called giants, emphasizing their autonomy as living beings, rather than, say, as extensions of the human body or as automata or performing objects. They're very rigorous about the language. Quote, "If Jean-Luc could do it without asking permission, he would," Martin Bolduc told me. He was as Montreal 375's chief producer and point of contact between the city and the provincial authorities, the society, and the company itself. Bolduc's job might be described as mediating between the forces of order, safety, and control, and those of street spontaneity, carnivalesque immersion, and storytelling. Each route had to be approved for the load-bearing capacities of streets, heights of wires and other overhead obstacles, and generally concerns for security amidst the movement of large crowds and convoys of heavy vehicles. Despite 3 years of planning and negotiation concerning each step of the 3-kilometer route with the city's special events, public works, transportation, police, and medical departments, it's due to a careful management of the theatrical space that they give the appearance of simply appearing, without too much advance notice as to their starting points or their routes through the city. We're watching history live, director Jean-Luc Courcou has written. Quote, and what people have seen, they believe. I take advantage of this era of synthetic images to try to bring the theater back to its source. 3 dimensions plus human power, this direct umbilical cord. What people like is to see, that one tells them a story like children love. A 9-meter-high giant or a 12-meter-high giraffe with 20 people on its back is already in itself an extraordinary story. So all it takes is a very simple scenario. End of quote. To keep the scenario simple and the visual field clear, affording a view and some interplay with the surrounding streets, buildings, and public spaces is harder than you'd think in a contemporary urban landscape. Much of the planning, then, is geared to how the audience will see the giants, the Lilliputians, and the support apparatus that enables the entourage of each character to process through the city. A square in the old port, a square in the old port becomes the little giant's overnight bedroom. The sidewalk next to the pier by the river becomes the beach upon which the diver is washed up the night before his first awakening. A crew of volunteers establish and maintain a boundary around each giant and its entourage. So these are some of the planning documents. So the red dots are volunteers holding a kind of like a ribbon, like a very simple colored ribbon, to sort of create a bubble that then travels through the city. So this traveling ring around each composed parade unit has at the center, for example, the deep sea diver, made of carved poplar wood and hydraulics at 25.5 tons and 35 feet high, not including the support vehicle, and with 31 manipulators. Or the little giant, 13 tons, 18 feet high, sometimes walking, sometimes riding a scooter, or wearing a yellow rain slicker and a yellow hat, braced on the deck of her fishing boat. And there, that's the cholo, the dog, who's actually paper mache, not carved wood. But here she is on her boat with her hat and her rain slicker, complete with real waves beneath and real sea breeze from industrial fans mounted in front. And I'll have to show you the video after because it's better when it's in motion. And you can see the fan and the water that's sort of built into the float. More than any moment, this particular image of the girl giant traveling alone on the sea recalls the allegorical floats and ship-like carts of official urban carnivals, the carus navalis, or nautical cart, considered by the philosopher Walter Benjamin as the potential etymological source of the word carnival. So he says carus navalis, nautical cart, is sort of where carnival comes from. Oh, and that's one more image of the different various parades units. There's a legend where each thing is obviously one of the giants, or there's a music truck that has a live band that plays on a flatbed trailer, and there's other support vehicles. Okay, carus navalis. Benjamin, writing his impressions from a visit to the celebrated Nice Carnival at the beginning of his years of exile from Germany in 1935, writes a brief newspaper piece for publication in the Frankfurter Zeitung in March of that year, 1935. An imaginary conversation while observing the giants and the mechanized floats passing in review. The essay is written in dialogue form, our narrator speaking with a guide who directs his attention to the year's carnival theme and the giant figures and mechanized floats passing by. They discuss the old idea, dating from the times of Roman Saturnalia, of carnival as a state of exception, wherein the city is festivalized, rules suspended, hierarchies inverted. Benjamin registers a certain skepticism, quote, "But an exceptional state really only stands out against an ordinary one," he reminds his friend on the balcony above the Place Massena. This is the main square of Carnival in Nice. Benjamin says, quote, "You meet with the extraordinary everywhere you turn. It's become our daily diet. Take that demonic fellow down there with the meter-long pencil behind his ear. He's supposed to represent the fairground chronicler, but doesn't he look most of all like the advertising puppet for a pencil factory? Don't a lot of those giant creatures look as if they'd just left their spot in the atrium of a department store to tag along with the carnival procession? Just look at that group of carts coming from the left. You must admit they look like an armed formation in the advertising campaign of a shoe company." End of quote. Benjamin emphasizes how these giants perform in the modern marketplace of commodities. He notes their ordinariness at the dawn of a media-saturated age where images are infinitely repeated, deployed in advertising campaigns, and designed to tell a story of capitalist desire and wish fulfillment. To paraphrase another essay of Benjamin's, he discerns the everyday in the monumental in the everyday. And I would say that's a bit what Oldenburg is talking about in the quote I started with. In contemporary terms, one thinks of the inflated giants of the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade in New York City, figures from films, cartoons, animation, and the commodity realm. Followed each year at the parade's conclusion by the float bearing Santa Claus, ritually opening the holiday shopping season on Black Friday. Gigantism is certainly a key feature of this spectacle. That's the diver's feet. But so then is the miniature, which accompanies the gigantic by contrast. The visual perception of scale and also one's relation to time are warped and become elastic. The diver appears the same size as a tall office building that's closer to the horizon. The street furniture, trees, and cars all seem miniature in the traveling visual field. This gradual, elastic transformation of scale is much of what attracts the crowd, provoking surprise and delight. The CBC Tower parking lot, that's where the final exit took place. The park, the plaza at the Place des Festivals, the broad boulevards of Park Avenue and René Lévesque, the Riverside Pier and the Old Port, despite their relatively vast scale, still manage to afford intimate moments of encounter, as when a kid peers out a third-story window to see the little giant's eye peering back. For all the well-deserved critique aimed at the programming omissions and what many saw as a municipal reenactment of the colonial erasure of First Nations life, culture, and history in the broader program of Montreal 375, the appearance of the giants succeeded in bringing a sense of mystery and liveness. They produced carnival time and festival space through the use of old-school analog materialist theater magic with no digital effects, other than the GPS tracking you could use to find their locations if you downloaded the app. And apparently 900,000 downloads happened of people trying to figure out where the giants were over the 3 days. Alessandro Falassi calls this time out of time a period of suspension, of cultural death and rebirth, parody and critique. The literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin, also writing in the 1930s around the same time as Benjamin, looked at the popular culture of the Middle Ages via an extended analysis of the tropes and imagery of the famous 16th century set of novels telling the adventures of two father and son giants, the life of Gargantua and of Pantagruel. Bakhtin's book, Rabelais and His World, is often cited for proposing key attributes of the carnivalesque, among them, and main one, laughter, specifically folk humor, broadening the term beyond simply referring to the performance context of carnival celebrations to formulate, quote, a system of popular festive images that went on living for thousands of years. Bakhtin writes, "We interpret the carnivalesque not only as carnival per se, but also the very popular festive life of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. All the peculiarities of this life have been preserved in the carnival." So you can find the carnivalesque not just in performance, but in painting or in storytelling or in poetry. Abstracted from the period of Rabelais, Bakhtin's notion of the carnivalesque refers then to this parallel upside-down world where figures of authority, piety, and permanence are ridiculed, debased, parodied, and rendered as ever-changing and renewable. The Royal Deluxe Giants produced this atmosphere in Montreal, both despite and thanks to the official context commemorating an origin story of dispossession. Old France claiming this piece of the Ganya-Gahaga nation as belonging to New France. Bakhtin highlights the experience of laughter, especially carnival laughter, directly connected to the serious of cults, religiosity, piety, and mysticism, in part via this kind of parody. People are not spectators at carnival, according to him. Rather, they live in it, and everyone participates. This kind of laughter, then, is festive, universal in scope and ambivalent, happy and sad and terrifying all at once. The appearance of the Royal Deluxe Giants, it seems to me, draws on these Bakhtinian qualities, animating an old idea of collective representation and experience, as old as the Middle Ages certainly, but also reaching back further to the Roman Saturnalia, as Benjamin notes. Part of what we experience is a brief snapshot, or perhaps a distant echo, this quality of unbroken tradition, despite the clearly modern technical apparatus, the contemporary urban backdrop, and the millions of cell phone photos and videos posted online. The Giants' progression through the city is slow, and the life of the city slows down to meet them in a kind of quiet frenzy of follow the leader. So I think I want to connect that back to what I said earlier about the director, Jean-Luc Coucou, and his roots in street theater as, sort of exerting some artistic control over time, space, limitations, vocabulary, how they move, how much is said, how much isn't said. Okay, getting there. Bakhtin has a few things to say specifically about giants, protagonists of carnival parades. Towns had their particular giant, families of them, connected to imagery of wealth and abundance. They come from far away and bring knowledge of exotic places. Benjamin's interlocutor above the procession of floats, above the Corso, says much the same thing. The cart is something that comes from far off. Anything from far off must have something special about it. And the gigantic creatures, he says, possess the innocence of children, and I suspect Jean-Luc Coucou would agree. Presentation of the giants took place within the frame of the official festivities and civic mobilization celebrating the 375th anniversary. The date refers to the founding of the fortress Ville-Marie, and you see also there the Canada 150 logo, which is something else I'll get to. The date references the founding of the fortress Ville-Marie on the year 1642 along the St. Lawrence River, on land previously occupied by the St. Lawrence Iroquois in a place called Hochelaga. De Maisonneuve, Jean Mance, and a crew of colonists from Quebec City celebrated the first Mass on the island on May 18th of that year, with the aim of establishing a colonial outpost to facilitate fur trade deeper into the territory of New France. Montreal was an important port linked to the Atlantic by the St. Lawrence River. However, rapids upstream made the island the last accessible point for cargo ships. This changed in the 1820s with the opening of the Lachine Canal, which allowed ships to bypass the rapids and effectively open the upper St. Lawrence to heavier trade and industrial development. And I'm mentioning all this because it connects a little bit to where Royal Deluxe has its home in Nantes in France. Montreal 375, as it happened, coincided with Canada 150, Another anniversary, the anniversary of the Confederacy of the Canadian Nation. Thus, Montreal 375 was celebrated in a context of contemporary attention to the nation's deeply problematic colonial history and the legacy of the occupation of First Nation lands, and in a spirit of competition with Canada's national celebrations, whereby Quebec's cultural nationhood, skill at festive manifestation, public-private financial partnership would be embodied in the programming choices made by the Society. On an international stage, Montreal 375 was designed to show off Montreal's competitiveness, tourist hospitality, and an embrace of urban technological innovation, most spectacularly displayed in the lighting of the Jacques Cartier Bridge, which had just taken place a few days before the Giants arrived. This $40 million lighting scheme created by the global special effects and events company Moment Factory, a project roughly 10 times the cost of Royal de Luxe's manifestation. The celebratory year also included $15 million in new infrastructure projects, green spaces and parks, a walking route connecting the mountain to the river. In other words, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of support, there's a lot of attention to this cycle of celebrations, and Royal de Luxe is kicking it off, basically. The Society, however, came under strong critique for basically ignoring the history of the First Nations of the island, particularly during a year in which truth and reconciliation was at the forefront of the national agenda. Quote, "What needs to happen is an acknowledgement of the past, of the negative impacts of colonial history, and how it still affects us today," veteran Mohawk activist and artist Ellen Gabriel told CBC News on the May 17th anniversary in 2017. Quote, "Until those things are addressed and dealt with in a respectful and honorable way, then it's really difficult for many of us to think that this is a time for celebration." So it's a very, I think it's clear, very contested moment. In formulating the route for the Giants, director Jean-Luc Coucou was drawn to the river, so integral to Montreal's founding mythology and imaginary life and its tourist economy. Montreal's affinities with the company's home city of Nantes come into focus when we look at their parallel 19th and 20th century histories. Nantes also straddles a river, the River Loire, 50 kilometers from the Atlantic Ocean. Culturally, it's linked to Brittany on the northwestern coast of France. It's also the birthplace of the prolific writer of 19th century visionary fantasy stories, Jules Verne. Nantes was a shipbuilding city, like Montreal, in those years, and through the late 20th as well. And these ingredients, a material environment geared to the engineering of slow-moving industrial machines, and the colonialist technological romance of Jules Verne's stories of extraordinary voyages to the moon, under the sea, around the world, and to the center of the earth, seem like a logical ground and context for Coucou's vocabulary. It should be noted that Royal de Luxe settled in Nantes at the invitation of the city's mayor to inhabit a vacant warehouse in 1989. Founded in Aix-en-Provence as a street theater company, they had moved to a site outside the city of Toulouse, a major European center of aircraft construction. And Royal de Luxe was founded in, I believe, 1979. So it's been around a while, and it's in its third home city. With the relatively recent closing of the shipyards, the Ile de Nantes, an island in the Loire River, became home to a year-round tourist installation of a related company, also using gigantic figures. Founded by the designer and engineer François Delarosière, after 21 years of collaborating with Coucou as a member of Royal de Luxe, the company La Machine has also become known for spectacular displays of giant mechanized figures and mythological beasts, a number of which live on permanent display alongside the company's open workshops on the island of Nantes. Delarosière is perhaps best known for the Sultan's elephant, originally a Royal de Luxe giant figure that has toured the world. This isn't it, this is their dragon and their spider. But after a parting of ways, the designer of the elephant basically left, founded La Machine, and La Machine essentially constructed a mechanized copy of the elephant designed to give rides to tourists in a kind of permanent installation of living display called Les Machines de l'Île, the machines on the island. The company is well known for a giant robotic spider, which you see up there, which along with a 12-meter dragon came to Ottawa for the Canada 150 celebrations. So there was a lot of confusion where you talk about the giants, oh, is that the spider? No, the spider's in Ottawa, and that's La Machine. But I'm trying to get a little bit the difference between the two. The La Machine giants do not have visible operators, for example. They're operated remotely, and they're more like automata or robots, I think. While they certainly share roots of the collaborative early decades of work as Royal Deluxe, the figures of La Machine appear to me to have evolved as something else, more robotic or mechanized, without the intimacy or humanity of Royal Deluxe's figures. And the difference here may have to do with the source of the physical effort, where Royal Deluxe's giants are far more dependent on the visible human labor, and La Machine's more on mechanized and remote control. David Calder links La Machine's island installation to the much-cited, quote, creative city script and the idea of cultural production as a replacement for industrial production in the revival of post-industrial urban neighborhoods. In particular, La Machine's permanent workshop, exhibition space, and performance manifestations were invited specifically to replace the bygone economic engine of marine construction. He also notes that access to La Machine's elephant and viewing platform is ticketed, implying something more like a steampunk Jules Verne-themed experience than the free and somewhat more mysterious experience of the Royal Deluxe giants when they appear in a city. I'm not trying to compare the two here, but rather note that different dramaturgical approaches to heritage and the strategies for the animation of public space are at work. A product of the theatrical experiments of the 1960s and after, Courcou draws on the environmental theater movement, concerning itself with mobilizing non-theatrical space or found environments in which the play and the audience inhabit the same space without being architecturally separated, and sometimes with indefinite and shifting boundaries. Though clearly indebted to the engineering know-how of La Machine's designers, Royal Deluxe retains this element of guerrilla theater. Courcou is fundamentally a maker of street theater. Since 2009, the Little Giant and the Deep Sea Diver have become regular guests of municipal and national celebrations, magnetically attracting crowds to celebrate origins and anniversaries. The Royal Deluxe giants, while certainly spectacular, turn streets, parks, and plazas into surprisingly intimate theatrical scenes and dreamscapes as they continue their picaresque narrative, separated and reunited with no apparent beginning or end. So I'm going to stop reading there, but I want to show you, obviously, what they look like moving. So I'm going to try playing this, but if it's all jerky, I may take it out of PowerPoint and just play it from the computer directly. And I don't know if it's worth it. This is just a little giant walking, obviously. Simple. show you, this next clip is a bit longer and a bit more slow moving, so it takes a little patience just because it doesn't look like a lot is happening. But they're basically setting up, this is the moment of the waking up of the deep sea diver on the second day when he's gone to sleep the night before in the CBC Tower parking lot. And they sleep through the night. So in other words, they come to a city for 3 days, they walk these routes through the city, and then they come to a resting place, and they're installed in public, with a very small crew. And I think there's some mechanized kind of breathing apparatus inside them, so they kind of, and there's sound of the breath, so they just basically sleep, but they're not motionless. There's a little bit of just a sort of sleeping motion, breathing motion. And then there's a kind of publicized hour, like 10 in the morning, when they're going to wake up. So this is, and they started late this morning, so there was a lot of waiting, and there was a very large crowd that you don't really see so much in the video. So this is the moment when they finally get going. In a second. Sorry, I'm going to just do something else. Sorry about this. I'm just going to play it not in PowerPoint because I can already see it as South Jersey. And we'll really look at that. If I can. That'll be easy to see.
Débridage de toutes les manœuvres, descente des écureuils. Rangement de l'électrophone, monsieur Armel. Descente des téléphones. Madame Guillaume fera une coiffure en tribord.
breaks, so obviously meal breaks, but also places where the giant will stop and do an action. So, you know, different people will be working their muscles and others will get a break at different times. I mean, I think part of the reason for this sort of cycling is you know, you're doing a pull every 10 pulls or something. 5 or 6. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And yeah, please ask questions. Oh, I think it's all customized. I think every piece of it is. I mean, there may be some elements that are like basically truck bodies or wheelbases that are generic, but I think it's all built in their shop. So that's the deal. So it takes many years to create one of them, but then. Yeah. Oh. Do we have time to show one more very short video? Just because
Yes.
I mentioned earlier the boat. This is like 19 seconds. And apologies for the shakiness of the video. This gives you a sense of the boat. Anyway, that's that. Raw, unedited video. So yeah, and maybe this would be a good moment to just take your questions or comments or thoughts or.
Yeah.
And I, what are we talking about here?
Yes. I think that's a great idea. And I wanted to say, I really appreciate your presentation,
Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you, John.
You know, on Facebook you see photographs, you'll see a photograph of Royal Deluxe, like,
Yeah.
oh my God, check this out, what is it?
Yeah.
And then it's like, it's Royal Deluxe.
Right.
And, you know, as a puppeteer, you want to know about what's going on, and I really appreciate the way you talk about what's going on with this giant puppet theater, and also the way you look at the history of it, where it's coming from, that it didn't just come out of nowhere. And also I really appreciate and understand now, after listening to you, better the difference between Royal Deluxe and its sense of itself as, in a way, a puppet theater with human operators, and then the La Machine's building of robots or giant figures that are operated independent of humans. And it makes me think about our friend Stephen Kaplan's essay, A Puppetry, where he talks about the distance between the puppet and the performer, the puppet and the puppeteer, and how that's a very important way of thinking about puppets. And there's so much to think about, and I really appreciate your doing this really interesting and challenging work to help us understand Royal Deluxe. So now we have questions, and people, like, we're doing it on YouTube Live, thanks to UCTV for the first time, so I don't know if people on the interwebs can ask questions easily, but we'll try to do that. So questions and comments, please, from the audience. Yes? Yes.
Sure, I'll start. So I guess I'm wondering, you mentioned that Benjamin refers to this as the carnival as an exceptional state. And so it's clear to me that when a giant puppet is brought into a space, there's a spectacular event that occurs that makes that space somehow more public. Like we have a more public experience of that space collectively. Could you speak to that a little bit also about what happens after those puppets disappear? Does that public energy continue in any way?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of people were this is purely anecdotal from my own, like I heard my kids say and other people say is that they missed the Giants after they had left. There was this, you know, and they're there for 3 days, so it's not a long time. But if it catches your imagination and you're one of the, again, 622 people, again, that's an estimate. How they make these estimates, there's no way to know. But lot of people put in the effort to go see them, hang out, watch, follow, take pictures, you know. So they do leave an impression, but it's one of those theater questions of what does theater do to you? What does theater mean? How does it leave its impression? It's very hard to track or to quantify or to know, but anecdotally, people were saying, oh, I miss the Giants, I wish they'd come back. Oh, I want to go to the next city where they're going to be and see the next, you know, the next sequence of the story, even though it's not really a sequential story, but it feels like it is, or it could be. And then to just get to the Benjamin question, I think Benjamin is, I tried to, a lot of people in performance studies in the field where I was trained as a scholar, academic type, people use Bakhtin a lot. When they talk about carnival and festival, he's sort of the go-to theory guy in the West, at least, in Western traditions. And, you know, he's a Russian writing in the 30s. And I discovered this little tiny piece, about 3.5 pages long, by Benjamin, written around the same time as Bakhtin is writing. And he has a, I don't want to say cynical, but a slightly more, certainly a more critical view, which is where he says, he talks about the figure of the carnival writer, or what's he called, scribe, or the carnival chronicler, or something like that. And he's got this giant pencil, and he's like you know, to exaggerate the feature, the attribute, which is that he's a writer, so that attribute has to be made giant and exaggerated. And Benjamin says, oh, well, nowadays, you know, you see things like this in advertising with billboards and mass communication, and you know, you see this, the specialness of the giant is no longer quite as special, because he wants to say capitalism is sort of absorbing these traditions and turning them into a kind of commodity narrative. So that's why I threw in the Thanksgiving inflatables, which is not to say there's anything wrong with that, but just that the way we see these figures used to be in a kind of, maybe in a ritual or a Lenten carnival moment, and you would only see them then and there, and you know, they had their very particular place. And I think Benjamin's saying, well, these are becoming reproducible, they're becoming common, they're becoming everyday. And I don't necessarily, I'm not sure how I feel about that, but these guys certainly, there's nothing like that. You know, when you see them in your city, there's nothing to compare them to, really. So.
Adrian.
It might be a silly question. Is the diver an homage to Jacques Cousteau?
I don't know. You know, there's a backstory behind the diver in the director's notes, where he basically says the diver dates to 1912 and the sinking of the Titanic, that the diver was on the Titanic, in the hold of the Titanic, and went down with the ship and was below the surface of the ocean for decades and is now reappearing. So there's this kind of slightly mysterious backstory. I've never heard anyone mention Jacques Cousteau, but that story, the story of a kind of ocean liner and a tragedy, and then the little giant is meant to be his niece, who he hasn't seen in all this time, and in each city they go to, they sort of start in opposite ends of the city and process towards each other and have a reuniting moment. Probably should have said that. At a certain point in each performance, or in each city. So it's not identical, but there's a backstory of where the giant has been and why they've been separated, and now they're together again.
I want to say, speaking of capitalism, we're doing fundraising.
Oh, yes.
And here's the good text to
Please give.
41444. So, we operate on a pretty small budget, so we appreciate all these things that people might donate. to Yukon
Can they
Gives.
donate from Facebook Live?
Yeah, you can donate from Facebook Live and from Facebook, and yes, it's all possible. Okay, excuse me for that interruption. Yes, Noel.
I have two questions. One is just like, can you confirm or deny the rumor that the diver goes in the water?
Oh, it has. Yeah, that was a big source of controversy. He was supposed to, so in Berlin and I think in Liverpool, the diver starts from under the water and emerges out. Like in Berlin, he was pulled out of one of the canals in the city. And in Montreal, the plan had been for a long, long time that he was going to not start, but exit, was going to disappear into the St. Lawrence River. And then it turned out that in May, at that time of year, the currents were bad and it was not opportune. And then they had figured out a way where they were going to use winches and they were going to fold him so he didn't have to go too deep. So he was going to sort of sit and get underwater that way with extra winches. And there was a whole plan worked out. And then because of Montreal 375, there's a pier in the, this is more than you want to know, but there's a pier into the river that is really the only one big enough to handle the crowd size. And that's the pier where Cirque du Soleil sets up its tents every other year. On even numbered years, they do a show in the port for Montreal people. And this was an odd number year, but they decided, oh, it's Montreal 375, we're going to do a circus that year, so that pier was off limits. And Cirque du Soleil is the regular tenant of that space, so they got it, and there was no way to really stage it. So that was a big disappointment, I think especially to the director, and there were a lot of sort of compensating plans that were tried. But yes, they do go underwater for sure. Or he does. I don't know about the others. But.
And then can you talk a little bit about like the construction as far as like who designed this puppet?
I don't really have the expertise to talk about it. I wish I did. I don't, and maybe someone else in the room knows. I mean, I know that I can tell you that a good number of the people who you see in the red coats who are operating these figures are also the builders. I mean, they travel with them, they fix them, they repair them, they build them on site, they take them apart for shipping home. So they're not separate from the performance crew. They're part of the team that sort of attends to them, travels with them, operates the pulleys. You know, so basically there's nobody touching them that, you know, that doesn't already know them very intimately as machines. As I said, there's 95 folks came with the company and then they hired 30 locals, you know, to work as performers. But I can't tell you if you mean like technical specs. I don't know. I can tell you things like the weight and the height and those sorts of things.
I was just thinking more of like who, like design-wise, somebody sat down and like,
Yeah, of course. I mean, well, I think Jean-Luc Coucou, the director, I mean, I think he's also the designer, and there are, I think at the very beginning there was that sketch that showed the diver with the apparatus, and there was a sketch of the dog. I think those are his designs, or longtime company members. And as I mentioned, the founder of the company La Machine had been a member of Royal Deluxe for 21 years and had designed some of these giant machines, and basically splintered off and founded this other company that also does giant, you know, fantastic machines. But I don't, yeah, and we also, John and I had the opportunity to visit a very cool installation outside of Toulouse, which is a kind of a giant art factory in a very, very large scale workspace where they job out some of the building. But I think the designs are done, you know, in-house by Royal Deluxe with a team of designers. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, young lady here.
Is there any theme or narrative that goes along with each incarnation of the giants when they appear in different cities?
Yeah.
Or is it just a spectacle of them living, that's it?
There is, but it's minimal. That's, so I didn't spend too much time on it. But yes, it's sort of what I just said about the Titanic, about their separation. tell you. Yeah, there are.
It's not like Cirque du Soleil has a theme. or
No,
story
no.
or-
I would say it's maybe 3 paragraphs. There's like he writes like 3 or 4 paragraphs for each show, and I have it here somewhere. Well, there's a pamphlet that gets distributed, to the populace before each show, and it has the routes, little maps of each day of where they're going to be each day, and where the stops are going to be. But they always say, this is approximate and there's going to be surprises. We don't know exactly what they're going to do. Like, they try to leave as much open as they can.
I think, did you say earlier when we were talking that the scenario is often published in like a program?
Yeah,
Or I
yeah.
don't know if the press does that, or did you just say
I
that
did,
so
yeah.
that maybe people have a sense of that?
Yeah.
But it is true that it seems to me sometimes when you see the reactions to it, it seems like it's more of the, oh my gosh, look at that, and people don't necessarily know that, but that's kind of okay.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of story involved, I guess is what I'm
I guess you would have
getting
to
at.
commit to staying with it the whole time, which maybe not.
Right, but I think even if you did, I think it's more the everyday actions, like the little girl has a shower, the dog comes and sleeps one night, the dog sleeps on her lap, which is super adorable. What else do they do? She has this routine where she does calisthenics. They stop in the middle of the street and they call like these exercises, and she does, sort of little calisthenics routine. And so it's about these sort of everyday life of these figures in a way, and then they reunite and
Do they embrace?
they embrace. Yeah, no, it's very touching. But you don't have the feeling that you're watching a soap opera of like, what will the next installment be or what will the next episode be? It doesn't feel like that's so important to people. Yeah.
Yes.
Does the dog have its own route? Or
The dog is
it
always with the girl,
always
pretty
with the girl?
much.
Okay.
Although he can travel much faster than the others. He's much lighter and much more mobile. So he can go way up ahead and then circle around and come back like dogs kind of do. And, so he's kind of making big loops, but he's part of her crew. Yeah.
Cat.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, obviously those big movements like the hugs and like the calisthenics, those are probably scripted and rehearsed, but how much like freedom do individual puppeteers have during sort of the micro movements? Not at all?
I don't think
Not even the
much
roll of the eyes?
at all. I mean, I think that critical moves like the eyes, I think those are super long-term veterans of the company, and I think they've probably evolved a way of working together so that the puppet has a kind of life, because, like the dozen kind of critical people who are maybe controlling the more, I don't know what you would call it, more effective or more emotive body parts, if you can say that, are probably long-term collaborators who always do exactly that job and are, who've developed something together very well. I mean, I don't want to say there's no spontaneity at all, but I think that is reserved kind of for the director to call, like, today we're going to do this instead of what we told everyone we were going to do. And, he likes to throw a wrench in things, reportedly. But I wouldn't say the individual, rope pullers are, I think they have to be kind of in lockstep pretty much, just in terms of the amount of weight they're dealing with. And I think a lot of what we were watching, by the way, in the long wait for the diver to stand up and get moving is just testing and rigging. Like, everything has to be, it's like a circus rigging. Everything has to be, clipped, tested, checked, rechecked. Like, there's a whole protocol of, everybody making sure that when the thing is up, it's in control.
I think of, like, we both had experience working with Bread and Puppet Theater, and some of the giant, like the giant Mother Earth puppet, which isn't upright, but it's like 80 feet long, and the arms are 30 feet long. But when you're thinking about, I want to hold up this part of the cloth so it doesn't sag. Like you're not,
The tension has to be kept.
yeah, the tension has to be, so you're pretty distant from thinking about the emotive possibilities of the puppet, the way you are if you have a hand puppet, it's like, well, if I go like that, it looks a little sad or something, and,
Right.
and you're one of 80
Right.
people, and,
Right.
I mean, it's a very, very interesting, you're very concentrated,
Yeah.
but it's very technical in a way, and simple.
Yeah.
But this is much more complicated.
Yeah,
but I'm
no, but I think that's right. I think that, yeah.
Yes, and then you.
Comment first,
Yeah.
I really like the way you addressed the colonial history
Okay.
of the area, and I think that's really interesting how the company, how your work is able to reconcile, or maybe still working on that,
Still working on it.
probably.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And I'd love to hear more about that,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's another time.
Yeah.
Also, I was wondering if you knew how old these puppets were, because I know like the Diver is a classic in their company.
The Little Giant and the Diver started in 2009. That's when they started the first performances of them. So they're going on 10 years. I don't know how long it took them to get built. I mean, but I know that they first started. The first performances using them were 2009. Mhm.
It's the same.
I assume, yeah. I don't think there's duplicates or anything. Yeah, yeah. Though to get back to your earlier comment, I mean, what I found in thinking about this more and more was, or I think I am still trying to reconcile the quite vocal critique of the Montreal 375. Let me back up for a second, which is to say that an interesting thing about this company is that they tend, you don't really see them booked into, you know, the Brooklyn Academy of Music Next Wave Festival, or, you know, a theater festival, or they're sort of operating on a different scale, both budget and space and time. So it's really these like commemorative events that are citywide or nationwide, or, you know, that are sort of municipal or civic. They were in Santiago, in the capital city in Chile, and they were, you know, there was, they say, 1 million people in the town, in the main square, and they had I'm not sure which puppet, maybe the Little Giant had tea with the president of the country, who came and they had a little table and a little teacup, and had a little tea ceremony. So they're sort of addressing, I don't know, whole cultures or whole territories in some sense, and that's a very different way of thinking about theater. So that raises the questions of, well, what nation are we talking about here really, and whose national story are we talking about here really? And Montreal 375, again, there was quite a bit of controversy. Ellen Gabriel, who I quoted, is a very well-known First Nations activist, nationally known in Canada, and she was like saying right there, like, that's not our celebration. So, and then added onto that is this layer of, it's a French company coming to Quebec, which is, you know, this colonial place, which has a real love-hate relationship with France. Mostly love, I think, but, you know, a certain amount of skepticism as well. And there were things that Cuckoo wanted to do that the local production team said, no, you shouldn't do that. You know, just.
Yeah, yes.
I think you answered what I was going to ask, how long it takes to
Right.
construct, not including the design, but the physical construction, and then if there are any thoughts to, not that these three characters aren't wonderful, if there are any others.
I really couldn't tell you. I don't have any insight into the workings of the company at all. Yeah, I don't know about the building time or anything like that.
And then for it to be waterproof, you're going to dunk him? Really? That's all they
Well, you think of like an air, I mean, they're like ships. I think of them as ships. Like, they're not really, like, water is the least of their problems, like, in a way. Or they're like airplanes, or they're like giant, you know, machines that are meant to.
And if it's, the head is if it's wood and
Right.
cloth and rope
Right.
and metal, maybe, it's not like electronics
Or
or
electronics, yeah,
paper
yeah,
that you're
yeah.
dunking in the
Is the
water.
weather ever a problem?
I imagine, I haven't heard of them ever having an issue with weather, but, yeah, I don't know.
Paul, and then young lady here.
I don't want to sound too gossipy, but
Please.
it seems like, I'm curious about the relationship between La Machine and Royal Deluxe. To have two very rare styles of puppet company in the same city
I
in
know.
France, and not like, there must be so much overlapping. I'm
Tension,
curious.
yes.
Must
Well,
be
and,
weird.
and one is a former member of the other, right? I mean, the founder of the one is so the only thing I can really say is that the difference that I see is also one that has to do with the role of the performer, and I think Cuckoo is really the director. He really his work prior to 2009 and from 79 onwards was really in street theater, and a lot of the street theater he did, he's has no interest in working on a stage or indoors. He's really interested in the outdoor experience. A lot of his earlier work used other kinds of vehicles, cars and boats, and he did make a show inside the hold of a ship that traveled to Latin America for the 1992, the 500th anniversary of Columbus. So in that case, he did work indoors, but it was inside a ship. So he's interested in vehicles, in streets, in these juxtapositions of scale. So I was telling John earlier, there's this one piece that is part of another piece that it's a car that's kind of crushed, and there's a giant fork through like a regular dinner fork through the top of the car, just as if like a giant from out of nowhere had just sort of plunged it through the top of this car. So things like that are kind of visual jokes or about the gigantic and about the miniature and about mysterious forces seem to capture his imagination. And I think it's just a very different aesthetic, even though some of the mechanical things may be shared between the two companies. But I think the giant spider and the giant dragons and these sort of giant, they're more like machines to me. They don't seem quite as alive.
And
in
it
the same
seems
way.
like the La Machine is trying to create like this experience, like almost an amusement park.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a
Especially
bit more
when they
rock and
plans
roll.
for that tree.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah, well, we were in Nantes for a brass band festival and went there, and it's true, like with the giant elephant, you don't see any performance like the people jumping off the platform to make the legs move on the diver. It's just the elephant.
Right. It's a ride.
I mean, yeah, it's a ride, so it
Buy
is like a
ticket and
theme
you get
park.
on it and you go for a
Did you
ride.
say there was a less mechanical version of that elephant that they built?
There's a Royal Deluxe, or the first Sultan's Elephant was part of a Royal Deluxe show, and I don't know how it moved or what its mechanics.
I think it didn't have a lot
It
of
didn't
people
have all
running
those
around
people,
it
no, right.
like that.
I think it was like a tractor. Yeah, I mean it was basically like built on like a giant tractor.
Yes, the young lady in the back had a...
Does Royal Deluxe get paid for their performances?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, for sure. So this project, the producer said to me that the bill really for what it costs, like the fee, the transportation, the labor, everything came to about $4 million. And he believes that there was probably close to another million that they were never billed for, like police overtime and other sort of hidden costs that the city just sort of absorbed. So depending on how you count when you get to these big numbers, it's hard to fix a number, but that's not what they got paid. That's what it cost to do it. So I have no insight into like what the company's fee would be or whatever, but you figure they do they do 2 or 3 cities in a year, so they're devoting, if you think of when, from the time they pack shipping containers, which is probably 3 months, 2-3 months in advance, and then packing and shipping home. They don't go on to another city, they go back to the home base. So it's, sort of 3 to 4 month window of the company's year. And then booking all these people who freelance and do other jobs, other times of the year, making sure they're all free and available. That's, it's a lot of people. And it's a lot of housing for a month, and it's, you can imagine the the cost. But yeah, everyone's paid, and the 30 locals who performed with them were also paid a salary for their time. So.
And I think they also get government support in France.
And they're massively supported by the French government. Yeah, you have to say too. Yes, so they wouldn't exist. I mean, I'm sure they're not living off their performance fees, for sure.
So
they're oh yes, a good segue.
So we can bring Royal Deluxe.
Good point. But yes, they have a kind of, what's the word? A sort of chosen status in terms of French arts funding, where they're kind of funded for life.
Other questions, comments, questions from the interwebs, the world of the interwebs?
What are the comments?
Right. No, there's all emojis. No.
What was that number again?
Yeah, right. 41444. So this was quite wonderful. Thank you, Mark, again.